Hello everyone, welcome to the Street Crime UK YouTube channel. Thank you for joining us. Please don't forget to like, share and subscribe for more content. Hello and thanks for joining us today. Today we take an in-depth look into a very dangerous and notorious UK criminal. A man who possessed immense strength, but it was to be this strength that caused his fellow criminal associates to turn on him. Francis Samuel Mitchell was born on the 19th of May 1929 and was also known as the Mad Axeman. Mr. Mitchell was an English criminal who was a criminal associate of the Kray Twins, although he was later murdered at their request. Born into a family of 7 in Canning Town on the 19th of May 1929, Mr. Mitchell was one of 7 children who were born into a working class family from Limehouse, East London. At the age of 9, he stole a bicycle from another child from his local area, for which he was taken before a juvenile court and put on probation. As an adult, Mr. Mitchell possessed great physical strength, and he liked to demonstrate it to others that he knew by showing off his ability to lift a grand piano off the floor, or being able to pick up 2 fully grown men. When he did this, he would lift up 1 man in each hand. It was also reported that Mr. Mitchell had a very short, violent and unforgiving temper, and according to Martin Fido, was a full-grown man who possessed the mind of a child of 13 or under. From the age of 17, Mr. Mitchell was regularly incarcerated and spent a lot of time in borstalls and prisons around the country. This was mostly for shop breaking and other petty crimes. During a brief spell of freedom that he did have, it was reported that he fathered a daughter with a girlfriend he was sleeping with at the time, but the relationship ended in a bad way and Mr. Mitchell never knew about her. In prison, Mr. Mitchell was reported by many officers to be a thorn in the flesh of authority. Mr. Mitchell's first prison sentence, for which he was sentenced to 12 months, was given on 9th of February 1948. On another occasion, in August 1952, he received 3 months after being caught with a stolen revolver, and with a growing number of petty crimes under his belt, Mr. Mitchell became trapped within the UK prison system. Mr. Mitchell's prison terms were characterised by extreme violence against guards and fellow inmates who he did not get along with, and he was regularly punished with the birch and cat-o'-nine-tails, which was used to whip prisoners who had misbehaved. It was also reported that Mr. Mitchell was one of the ringleaders that caused thousands of pounds in the damage during a riot at Rochester Borstal. He slashed a guard across the face and was charged with attempted murder after attacking an inmate he believed had informed on him. He was later acquitted. In 1955, Mr. Mitchell was declared mentally defective by medical professionals and was sent to Rampton Secure Hospital in Nottinghamshire, which is a maximum security psychiatric hospital. We will be covering all the mental institutions and prisons in the UK in a new series, so keep an eye out for that, everyone. 2 years later on the 18th of January 1957, Mr. Mitchell escaped with fellow inmate Richard Maskell after getting duplicate prison keys made. Once free, Mr. Mitchell and Mr. Maskell terrorised the quiet, sleepy villages that surrounded Rampton for several days, in which time they attacked a man, Mr. Leonard Collingburn, with an iron bar before stealing his clothes and money. When he was recaptured, Mr. Mitchell attacked the police who had apprehended him with 2 meat cleavers and was then sent to Broadmoor Mental Institution. He somehow managed to escape again, and this time broke into a private home and held a married couple who were inside hostage with an axe, for which he was nicknamed the Mad Axeman in the press. In October of 1958, he was sentenced to life imprisonment for robbery with an aggravating factor being violence. Mr. Mitchell was this time sent to Dartmoor Prison in 1962, and whilst there his behaviour improved dramatically. Whilst in prison as a hobby, Mr. Mitchell kept budgies, and for his good work and improved behaviour, he was transferred to the Honour Party, a small group of trustees who were allowed to work outside the prison walls with minimal supervision. Mr. Mitchell was permitted to roam the moors and feed the wild ponies, and even visited nearby pubs. On one occasion he caught a taxi to Oakhampton to buy a budgie. The governor of the prison promised Mr. Mitchell that if he stayed out of trouble he would recommend to the Home Office that Mr. Mitchell be given a release date. 4 years later, after being given this promise, it was reported that Mr. Mitchell was aggrieved that he had still not received one. Mr. Mitchell had become good friends with Reggie Kray when they served a sentence together at Wandsworth Prison in the 50s. During Mr. Mitchell's trial for attempted murder, Ronnie Kray had hired Mr. Mitchell, a top barrister, for him and paid for him to have a new suit fitted. Ronnie Kray was keen on breaking Mr. Mitchell out of prison, thinking it would help him to publicise his grievance and earn a release date, as well as enhance the Kray standing in the underworld. Reggie Kray recalled that he was, at first, very reluctant to the idea, but finally reasoned that if nothing else, it would stick two fingers up to the law. Reggie Kray visited Mr. Mitchell at Dartmoor in disguise and informed him of the plan on the 12th of December 1966. While with a small work party on the moors, Mr. Mitchell asked the sole guard for permission to feed some nearby Dartmoor ponies. Mr. Mitchell's request was granted. He walked over to a quiet road where a getaway car was waiting for him, containing associates of the Krays. Inside the car was Mr. Albert Donahue, Mad Teddy Smith, and Billy Exley, and they all drove to London together. Once in London, the Krays put him up in a flat in Barking Road, East Ham, which was at the time owned by Lenny Dunn. It was over 5 hours before Mr. Mitchell was reported missing to the authorities. Mr. Mitchell's escape made national news and led to a political storm over the relaxed security that was given to a man who was described in the press as Britain's most violent convict. And the subject of privileges that should be granted to somebody as dangerous as Mr. Mitchell whilst in the prison system was debated in the House of Commons. A large manhunt ensued, with 200 policemen, 100 Royal Marines, and a Royal Air Force helicopter searching the moors. With the aid of Teddy Smith, Mr. Mitchell wrote to national newspapers, and his plea to be granted a release date was printed in the Times and the Daily Mirror. However, the then Secretary Roy Jenkins was not willing to negotiate with an escaped criminal and would not review his status at all until Mr. Mitchell was back in custody. Mr. Mitchell soon became a problem for the Krays. Owing to his physical strength and short temper, he was a very difficult man to try and keep under control. He was unwilling to give himself up and return to the prison, and was not allowed to leave the flat in case he was recognised. The Kray twins feared to release him back into the public, or even turning him into the police themselves, as he could implicate them in his prison escape. Mr. Mitchell felt insulted that Reggie Kray had only visited him in person once, and was particularly upset that he could not visit his parents despite them living nearby. He grew increasingly agitated and began making threats against the Krays. In an attempt to help him blow off some steam, they brought a woman to the flat who went by the name of Lisa Prescott. Miss Prescott was a blonde nightclub hostess with an amazing figure, with whom Mr. Mitchell fell in love very quickly. This did not help the Kray twins, if at all anything it only caused further complications to the situation. It appears that this was the final straw for the Krays, who now decided that the only solution was to get rid of Mr. Mitchell. On the 24th of December 1966, Mr. Mitchell was led into the back of a van by Albert Donahue. Thinking he was to be taken to a new safe house in the countryside where he would meet up with Ronnie Kray, he jumped in without any worries. There was almost another argument when he realised that Lisa would not be coming with him, and Mr. Donahue persuaded him that it was safer for her to follow later on. Waiting in the van were several men, among them Freddie Foreman and Alfie Gerard, who were both armed with revolvers. Once the van doors were closed and the engine started, they opened fire on Mr. Mitchell, killing him. Mr. Donahue thought that 12 shots were fired before Mr. Mitchell died. His body was never recovered. Mr. Foreman later revealed that Mitchell's body was bound with chicken wire, weighted down and dumped in the English Channel. Reggie Kray had later told that helping Mr. Mitchell escape from prison was one of his biggest mistakes that he had ever made. In 1968, the Kray twins and various accomplices were arrested and put on trial for an array of offences, including the murders of George Cornell, Jack McVitie and Frank Mitchell. We have videos on our channel on both George Cornell and Jack McVitie, so if you'd like to see them, go check them out and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss our new videos. Their attempt to convince gang member Albert Donahue into confessing to killing Mr. Mitchell led to him instead becoming a witness for the Crown, and this meant Mr. Donahue would be testifying against them. Ronnie, Reggie and Charlie Kray, along with Freddie Foreman, were all acquitted of Mr. Mitchell's murder. This was due to a lack of evidence and the perceived unreliability of Mr. Donahue's testimony. Reggie Kray was however found guilty of conspiring to effect Mr. Mitchell's escape from Dartmoor, for which he received a 5-year sentence to run concurrently with his other sentences. Mr. Donahue and another firm member, John Dixon, pleaded guilty to harbouring Mr. Mitchell and respectively received 18-month and 9-month sentences. In his 1996 autobiography, Respect, Mr. Foreman admitted to shooting Mr. Mitchell as a favour to the Krays. Mr. Donahue said Mr. Foreman was paid £1,000 for it. Mr. Foreman was arrested and questioned by police after repeating his confession in a year 2000 television documentary. But the Crown Prosecution Service announced that it would not be reopening the case due to the then extant double jeopardy law. Francis Samuel Mitchell, or the Mad Axeman, the life he lived, or the crimes he committed, will never be forgotten in the UK criminal underworld. Thank you all for watching, and until next time, stay safe.